Shall I carry on? Alison, I'm terrible at introductions, as this is my first. So, Alison, you are all the way from Australia, right? And I believe this time from Switzerland, you were halfway through. May I let you introduce yourself? Okay. And are we recording? Perfect. Are we holding on to this?
Okay. Horrific. Thank you so much, Mel. Just get my gear. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all so much for coming along tonight. Before we do head into fungal realms, I do have a couple of other thank yous, particularly to the South Vancouver Island Mycological Society for inviting me along. It was my most exciting gig in the whole tour, but don't tell the others that. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be here for my very first time on the island, in Canada indeed. And particularly to Kurt Rader, who's been not only the most amazing host, but entertainer, chef, chauffeur, and I haven't told him yet, but I'm not actually leaving. I feel very comfortable there. I've got used to this amazing diet, that comfortable bed, the wonderful conversations that we've had over the last days, and to being chauffeured around. So that's it, Kurt. I'm really sorry, but I'm staying. Is that okay? Wonderful. Now, you've been the most magnificent host, so thank you so much. Indeed. Also to Denise, who chauffeured me around, took me to some of your magnificent forests, and walking through your forests. The thing that strikes me after spending a lot of time in Europe is that you love old trees. There's still some wonderful old trees there. So that makes my heart sing. Being in Central Europe, it's pretty hard to find a tree over 100 years unless you're in a city. That's the place where trees are protected. But in the forest, they're all on high rotation forestry. So it's such an incredible delight to me among these elders in the forest. So, and all of the others who accompanied us on those field trips, thank you for coming along. I learnt so much, learnt new fungal genera, learnt more about trees, and just enjoyed your company out in the forest. So thank you to David and Sinclair and Mel and Kem and all of the people, Alan, who were out there in those two forays. Also to Munro Books and Jessica for coming along tonight. I really appreciate it. And also to the Stunz Foundation, and particularly to Steve Trudell, who made this tour possible again. I had the great pleasure of being sponsored by the Stunz Foundation in 2019, and that was an incredible privilege. But I think Steve must have got in the ear and said, bring her back, in their ear. So I'm absolutely delighted that they could sponsor me to return again. I think that was all the thank yous I had on my list. And also to you all for coming along tonight. I very much appreciate your interest and support. Before we head into fungal realms, I just wanted to share a little anecdote with you. A couple of weeks ago, before I took the plane from Zurich to Seattle, I was expecting a package in the post, and that package was from the University of Chicago Press, that's who I forgot to thank, who have just published my most recent book. And I was waiting for this package to arrive. And I know some of you are authors and writers, and I'm sure you know that feeling when you've spent a year or several years writing, and all those thoughts in your head and all the research and trying to get the science correct, and all of the time you spent trying to bring it all together, getting it onto the page. That moment of seeing that it actually materializes into a book, it's a pretty exciting moment. And I was thinking about, this book's going to arrive, the review copy will come from the publisher shortly. But you see, on more than one occasion, I've heard how authors and editors meticulously scan the manuscript for typographical errors, only to miss that glaring one. It's in size 80 font on the cover, in either the title or their name. And I know two authors who this has actually happened to. And so evidently, you see, the problem is my name, Alison, in some spell checks, it might come up as illusion or liaison, both of which are almost anagrams of my name. So obviously I was worried about this, and I took it into my subconscious. And I had this dream, in fact, I had two, that I hear the post arrive, I hear the motorbike, the clink of the letterbox, I tear downstairs and I get the parcel out, run back upstairs and open this box, and the book was beautifully wrapped in the Chicago University Press paper. There was none of this sort of polite sliding my thumb under the tape. No, I tore it off like a child with a Christmas present, and I hold up the book, meetings, checking the spelling with remarkable ABLE, mushrooms, phew, all correct. And then I get to my name. Well, it didn't say illusion, And it didn't say liaison. It said Oprah Winfrey. Can you believe that? She stole the authorship of my book. I was absolutely outraged. Like, I know she knows a lot of things about a lot of things, but what does she know about mushrooms? I couldn't believe it. The good thing, though, about dreams is you wake up from them and no one ever finds out all those terrible things you said about them in the dream. It was only a few days later, it became one of those, repeating dreams. Exactly the same setting. I hear the motorbike. I hear the clink of the letterbox. I race downstairs. I grab the parcel. Except this time there was something wrong because I grabbed the parcel and it was only this big. I thought, oh, they've changed the format of the book, but never mind. I carry the parcel upstairs, tear the wrapping off, look at the title. Oh, I better get a magnifying glass. I look at the title, meetings with, all spelled correctly, remarkable mushrooms, wasn't Oprah Winfrey, Alison, Pouliot, everything's correct. Then I opened the book and I'd had a small oversight. I'd actually forgotten to write the book. There was no content. I was so fixated on getting the title right and my name right that I actually forgot to write the book. Thankfully, these were both dreams. When the book finally did arrive, everything seemed to be in place, but perhaps just check your copies if you happen to buy one. Hopefully, everything's spelled correctly. And there's also some content in there as well. So over the last 25 years, I've been running all sorts of forays and workshops and seminars to, I guess, spread the word about fungi, to try and all sorts of people, from students at university level, high school, primary level, but also general public, rangers working in national parks, other people working in conservation, First Nations people, gardeners, horticulturists, arborists, all sorts of people working with fungi. But what I've noticed is that the demographic of who's interested in fungi has just rapidly or radically increased in the last few years. And I think we are in something of a fungal moment or a fungal awakening. And has that been the case here? Is it really, fungi really taken off? I mean, they really seem to be trending. We're seeing everywhere all sorts of people who before didn't express much interest in fungi seem to be getting fungally infected. And, we know there's no going back. And, years ago, I'd set most of my workshops, I'll set up a big display table. So when people walk in, they see a bigger diversity than what perhaps we'll see on our foray. I'll go out to all these different types of forests and woodlands and collect fungi from different habitats. So people see this display when they come in. And when they arrive, I'll ask them why they come. And most people usually fall into the camp of foragers or forayers. So forayers are those, probably, I don't know whether you use the same differentiation, but we talk about forayers as those who have a scientific interest. So they might be doing a survey or looking for an endangered species or just documenting what's there like we did yesterday. Whereas the foragers, of course, are targeting the edible species. So they'd come along to learn what's edible, and of course the doppelganger, the toxic lookalike species. So most people were either forayers or foragers. And so I asked people what their interests are so I can get an idea of how to shape and focus the workshop. And this woman comes into a workshop when I was just before I left Australia, and she comes in and she's very, very serious, and she walks up to the table and she's photographing and fastidiously taking notes. And I thought, oh, when I came up to her and I said, so what brings you along tonight? Are you a forayer or a forager? And she looks at me and she said, no, I'm a crime fiction writer. I went, oh, okay. What brings you to a mushroom workshop? And she looked at me, she said, well, I'm looking for a mushroom that will cure a philandering husband. So we spent a lot of that workshop talking about the death cap, Amanita phalloides. And so I thought, wow, this is wonderful. Like, it's not just your forays and foragers, but we've got literary people coming along, weaving mushrooms into their stories. And then another woman walked in and she was also very fixated on the display. And I said to her, so, you're a forayer or a forager or perhaps a crime fiction writer? And she looked at me, she said, no, I'm a dancer. I said, a dancer? I said, at a mushroom workshop. This is the mushroom workshop. And she said, yes, of course. And she said, I'm not really interested in mushrooms. I said, oh, okay. She said, but the mycelium. She said, I'm choreographing a new dance piece based on this notion of mycelial connections, of the mycorrhizal relationships, or the wood wide web, as it's popularly called these days. And I thought, wow, isn't this wonderful that she was inspired to do this dance piece, all based on the notion of mycelium. I thought, stand aside Swan Lake. We've got mycelial forests. This is a really exciting time. And then I had fashion designers come in who are producing, do you call it Milo here? M-Y-L-O? So vegan leather made from fungus mycelium. I've had bioengineers who are 3D printing. I've had academics who are, again, using fungi more in the metaphorical sense to think about different ways of thinking about perhaps social systems and political systems. So for me, it's a really exciting time that we've got this really big demographic of people who are now coming, not just to forays and foragers. And I've been very fortunate over the last 20 odd years that I get to spend the fall, the autumn in Australia or in the Southern Hemisphere. And then when the winter sets in and the fungi start to hunker down, I switch hemispheres and follow the fungi to the Northern Hemisphere, where your fungi are just waking up. So I get myself a double dose of fungi in each hemisphere. And it's been wonderful for me not just to understand different ecosystem types and how the fungi interact and different fungi. Indeed, yesterday, there's all these new genera, not just species, but new genera. So it's exciting to see these different fungi, different forests, different ecosystem types, but also the different cultural responses. And I've seen radically different responses in different countries. I mean, an Italian forager approaches fungi in a very different way to a Swedish mycologist, which is probably very differently, again, to someone from the Canadian Mycological, from the Vancouver Island Mycological Society. So it's been very interesting to see these different human perceptions as well. When I first got to Central Europe, to Switzerland in 23 years ago, I came across possibly the kookiest group of people I've ever encountered. This is the Pilzkontrolleur, the mushroom inspectors. And I know that Switzerland isn't the only country to have mushroom inspectors. I know, for example, in France, some pharmacists also learnt about edible and toxic fungi, and they had their big posters up in the pharmacy and you could go in and get mushrooms identified. Although in recent years, when I talk to pharmacists, they say, oh, it's not actually part of the curriculum. It's just if you're lucky enough to have a teacher who has an interest in fungi. So I don't know that that's still the case, that they're always got these people who know about fungi in the pharmacies. I know in Finland and also in Sweden in autumn, they often have people out in the forest who are helping to identify. But Switzerland have had mushroom inspectors, or Pilzkontrolleur, for over 100 years. And I think that's pretty astonishing. And obviously it came about because people were getting poisoned. I mean, remember, Switzerland was a very poor country up until the Second World War, and there was a lot of subsistence foraging, and obviously a lot of people were getting sick. Today, think about, I'm trying to think how many times Switzerland would fit into Canada. How many square kilometres is Canada? I know it would fit into Washington State about 9 times or something. I think I worked it out. It's about 40,000 square kilometres, but it's a little country. And yet they've got 409 inspection officers and 1,500 mushroom inspectors. And you go along to them with your basket full of mushrooms, they pluck out the toxic ones and they send you home with a basket full of edible fungi. And I just think this is the most amazing service. And so many people I've met are mushroom inspectors, and they've got to go through a pretty lengthy training at their own expense over several years. I mean, you know, you've got, when you do your test at the end, you've got to get 100%. You can't get 60% or 99%. You've got to get 100%. And just to set the scene, the first time I went to the mushroom inspector, I'm in this little town called Bilbien, which is about midway between Geneva in the west and Zurich in the east. So it's sort of midway between the two in the canton of Bern. And it's the mushroom inspection office was in the old town. So the town settled in 1220. You've still got the wall, the old wall around the town. You've got the courthouse. You've got the church. You've got the theatre. And you've got the mushroom inspection office, not in that order of importance. We know that the mushroom inspection office is higher than the church and the courthouse and the theatre. And you've got the old cobblestone ground there as well. And the mushroom inspection office would open at 7 a.m. So I'd get there with Swiss punctuality at 6:59. And I'd come hoiking around the corner on my bicycle. And on the back, I'd have the most carefully curated collection of the most poisonous fungi I could find. And so I'd take it off my bike, and the inspection office was here. I look up at the clock on the church, hit 7 o'clock, and there was a big rectangular window of the mushroom inspection office, and I'd peer in, and there was a 3-metre table inside. And there was all kinds of technical books and field guides and scientific papers and all these chemicals and reagents and those wonderful old Zeiss microscopes with all the sort of polished, they smell a bit, remember when you turn an old Mixmaster on, that wonderful smell? These old microscopes had this wonderful smell and polished, all the metal worn smooth from years of people using them. And behind this table were 3 octogenarian bearded mushroom police, very, very serious, standing there like this behind the table, all waiting for the onslaught of foolish foragers who are coming in with poisonous fungi. And I look through the window and go, bonjour, 7 o'clock. You know what they'd do? They'd be standing there, they'd go like this. And they'd see me and they'd go like this. They'd try and hide. Then they must have been thinking, she's back. She comes in yesterday with a basket full of toxic fungi. We take them all away from her. She goes out and picks them again. She did this the day before that, and the day before that, and the day before that. What is it about Australians? They're a little bit slow or something, evidently. She keeps bringing in baskets full of toxic and usually deadly fungi. But the point was, I wasn't really a forager. I was much more so a foray and a photographer. But I thought, I better get into this foraging caper. I'm in Switzerland. But I was very interested in the different types of fungal toxins, and I wanted to know which one's going to give me an almighty stomachache, which one's got gastrointestinal toxins, things like chlorophylla molybdites or the false parasol, or some of your carbolic phenol-containing agaricus that we know are, a cause of a lot of poisonings, or perhaps something like the sulfur tuft, Hyphiloma fasciculare. They're just gastrointestinal toxins. Once you manage to expel them out of whichever orifice they can escape fastest, you'll make a full recovery. But then there's all sorts of other toxins. I wanted to know which ones might dismantle my kidneys. And some contain a compound called arelanine, such as within, for example, the genus Cortinarius, particularly things like Cortinarius aurelianus, but also in Australia we have one called Cortinarius eartoxicus. And we only know it contains arelanine because 3 people cooked it and wound up in the hospital in Hobart in Tasmania, all put on dialysis, and all have since had kidney transplants. And then there's those fungi that will not only destroy your kidneys, but also deconstruct your liver. Of course, the death cap, Amanita phalloides, will also destroy both of those. But then perhaps it could be a toxin that might cause desquamation or peeling of the palms, not from touching it, but from eating it. And this is only a very, very minor symptom compared to all of the other symptoms that you can get if you eat something called the poison fire coral fungus, or Trichoderma cornudae, which has caused many deaths in Korea and Japan. The fungus has been recently found in Australia as well. We're not sure whether it's been brought in or whether it was there all the time and we just haven't noticed. Or could that toxin, for example, send me on a trip, which is what we technically call a neurotoxin, things like psilocin and psilocybin, which are contained within the fungus genus psilocybe, and a couple of others as well. Or maybe the fungus won't cause any problem at all until I pour that lovely glass of vino and I actually get poisoned by the alcohol, not by the fungus, because it contains a compound called coprine, which affects my ability to metabolize the alcohol. So there's all these different types of fungal toxins, and then there's some that we don't fully understand. You might have heard of the Paxillus syndrome that we get from eating Paxillus fungi, what do you call them here? Roll rims, I think is the common name for them, which it causes an autoimmune response, but we don't fully understand it. But we know that the German mycologist Julius Schäfer in 1945, having eaten this fungus all his life, had one too many. He went into an autoimmune response and he died. So there's still fungal toxins that toxicologists are still trying to understand how they actually work. And of course, we're not machines. We're all different in terms of how we process or metabolize these toxins. So a lot of the time I spent there over the years, they've gradually started to tolerate me, and they realized that I was picking the toxic ones purposefully, and they let me just hang out with them and learn from them. And I'd watch people walk in with their baskets full of fungi because I wanted to know why they're mixing it up. Can they not smell the difference between a mushroom that smells phenolic or carbolic or has that sort of iodine or Indian ink-like sort of disinfectant smell, or say one that has a smell like bitter almond, or one that just has that earthy mushroomy smell? Can they not differentiate those smells? Or is it that they can't differentiate a spruce from a pine from a fir? Because, of course, we know particular fungi grow with particular tree genera. So if they're looking for a target edible, but they're under the wrong tree species or tree genera, they're going to mix it up. Or is it that they just get overexcited in the forest and collect everything but forget what they've collected where? And you see someone walk in with a basket of 400 different species and you go, pick the beginner. It's often the one who's got collected everything but without really paying attention to where they're collecting it, what sort of substrate is it growing in, with what tree species, what time of year. So I learned a lot about why people were mixing things up. And when I had a look at the Swiss Tox Info Poisons Information Centre list of what species are poisoning people, what do you think was number one? Because they actually differentiate which species people were eating. What fungus species caused the greatest number of calls within the year to the Poisons Information Centre? What do you think it might have been? I would have expected it would be in Xanthodermis or one of the agaricus. That's what I would have expected, but it wasn't. Anyone brave enough to have a guess? Well, again, that would be one you might expect, or psilocybe or something like that. Guess what it was? Sorry? Again, that would be one you might expect. You've got to be surprised what I'm going to say. It was Boletus edulis, a totally edible mushroom. Why is it the mushroom that causes the greatest number of calls? But when I watched what people brought in, the thing that shocked me was the condition. So when you come in with your basket, you put them into these trays and they inspect them. They'd lift out this Boletus edulis and all the maggots would run down their arm. And I'd think, why is it that we can't judge a good mushroom from one that's past its best? I'm sure these same people, when they go to the farmer's market, they don't pick up the peach that's got whiskers and their thumb goes through it when they pick it up. I thought, what? Why? And I'm sure they don't get that fish that's got a cloudy eye and all the scales are falling off and it smells rotten. So why can't they recognise the perfect Boletus edulis? And then I realised, I think I'm going to start a new genre called mycopsychology, or maybe psychomycology or mycopsychology, because I think there's this tension. This fungus is so revered. The Boletus edulis or porcini or the Sepp or Steinpilz, what's it called here? Is it the king mushroom, is it? The king? All of those. I think this mushroom is the one that everyone's looking for in the woods, but sometimes there's this person who Sunday morning they get up a bit late and it's 10 o'clock till they get to the forest, and guess what? They get there and all they're seeing is where they've been cut off. Everything's gone. And so they see one that everyone's left behind because it wasn't good enough, but they've told their new girlfriend, I'm going to come home with the foraged mushrooms. There's this tension around collecting this mushroom. So they'll pick the one that's not looking too good. And what they're actually getting poisoned by is not the fungus, but the bacteria that's colonizing the fungus. And I say, if that's you and you can't get up early enough, just go to the forest and collect a few pine needles and go and buy some in the supermarket and sprinkle them on top and come home so it looks like you collected them. But the second fungus was Cantharellus cibarius on this list. The first four fungi were all edible fungi. So I thought it must either be the condition or simply the quantity. And you know what it's like when you find the first chanterelle and then you see there's 700 within 3 square metres, and we pick a lot. And in Australia, for example, we're pretty new to this foraging caper, and we tend to find something and go, wow, better eat all of those. And I think what a lot of them are experiencing is not poisoning, but a chronic case of gluttony. And I think it's the indigestion. It's not actually poisoning, but they get this shocking indigestion and ring up. And I think the fact that these first 4 species on the list were all edible suggests that either just simply too many, they're trying to break down chitin, but this very recalcitrant compound that our enzymes to break down chitinase, we have to break it down. But I think in many people, this enzyme is fairly inactive. We have a lot of trouble breaking it down. And I think it's simply often indigestion or it's bacterial colonization, the fungi. So it's been very interesting just to sit and to observe year after year what people are bringing in and why these poisonings are happening. But I think a lot of it's simply things like people not smelling them or not knowing the diagnostic features. And the latest one is reliance on apps. So I'm thinking that perhaps a lot of people don't want to do the hard yards of learning the tree species and getting a sense of the genus. So it's been a very interesting time. And there's a friend of mine, Barbara Holenstein, and she's one of the best mushroom inspectors. And I was out in the forest with her, and she's an artist. She loves drawing them as well as identifying them. And as a photographer, I like photographing them. So we both have an aesthetic interest as well as a scientific interest. And we're out in the forest together, and mostly we're just photographing, drawing, whatever. But when you see that most perfect fat porcino sitting there and the sun coming through the trees and glancing off it, you think, you just can't leave it there lonely in the forest. That one's got to come home. But there's always this tension with the Swiss because they're very polite people. They'll never speak over you or get in your way. And I'm walking along, we're in step, and I'm thinking, I'm sure I saw it first. But I look across at Barbara because, I don't want to push in. I thought, I'm convinced I saw it first. I look across to her. She's a bit shorter than me, so I looked down, but she was already flying horizontally through the air towards the mushroom, and everything kind of goes into slow motion, and she's flying through the air towards my mushroom. I see her hand reaching into her pocket, coming towards the mushroom, and then I look at it, and I see nibbling its way across the top was this tiny little mouse on the mushroom. Barbara hits the ground, and I yell out, "Wait!" And her knife's coming towards the mushroom. Clunk, everything goes back into real time. She turns around, she goes, "What? Why?" I said, "Did you see there was a mouse?" She said, "Yes." I think, I just got my citizenship, you see, and I think I was just about to lose it. If you dare get between a Swiss person and their porcino, that's a very dangerous position to be in. I said, "Barbara, there was a mouse eating the mushroom." She said, "Yes." I said, there's not a lot of animals left in Switzerland, and it was there first, eating the mushroom. And she looked at me with this expression I've never seen before. She said, "So you're defending a rodent?" I mean, you know how much I love porcini. And I said, "Well, sure, but the mouse was there first." I said, "Look, I've got an idea." I said, "What about you cut it in half? You take half and you leave half for the mushroom, for the mouse." She looked at me incredulous, like it was the most outrageous thing I could have suggested, but very agreeable people. They never want conflict, argument. She takes out a knife, she measures the cat, Swiss precision, and she cuts it exactly in half. She puts half in her basket, stomps off through the forest, didn't speak to me for the rest of the day. But I kept my citizenship. Anyway, a week later, we're in the forest again, walking together. This time I see another one, twice the size, twice as perfect, no mouse, sun glancing off it. I turn around to look at Barbara, and she's 3 steps behind. I knew I'd seen it first. I fly through the air, slow motion again, hit the ground, getting my knife, and I hear, "Wait!" behind me. I'm like, "What?" She said, "There could be a mouse." I said, "Barbara, there's no mouse." She said, "Swiss mice are very surreptitious. There's lots of wood and ferns and moss. You don't know." I said, "Barbara, there's no mouse. There's no nibble mark on it." She said, "You always say to me, Dr. Pouliot, precautionary principle. You should just, just in case there was a mouse." I can't believe it. She's turned it back to me. And I thought, can't believe she's doing this. I took out my knife. I measured it. I cut it exactly in half, except my knife went crooked and only got a third of the mushroom. But I put it in my basket. I storm off through the forest, and I'm thinking, hang on a minute. I just want to check something. I turn around. Of course, Barbara swiped the other half. So anyway, it's been a lot of fun working with the mushroom inspectors. I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot about Swiss politeness. I've learned a lot about toxic fungi. But I think I was going to show you some pictures. That's what I was really here for, wasn't it? Anyway, so I thought I'd just give you a quick whiz around the kingdom and about some of our, no, this is not, going the wrong way, I know. There we go. I thought I'd start with a map of Australia kindly created by a slime mould. I'm not sure, is this tubifera? Who's our mixo expert in the room? I think this might be a tubiferous spine mould who created this wonderful map of Australia. Although you can see there's already a bit of climate change going on because Victoria, which is the state down here, is already inundated. We've lost that. Tasmania's floated a little bit further south. We do have some dangerous megafauna, as you can see there. There's some kind of megafauna, but most of the country is pretty much desert. So, and it's really along the fringes. We've got vegetation. Of course, at the upper half, the northern half is tropical, southern half is temperate. And here's a map of Europe in comparison, which I find really difficult to try and get my head around political borders and where borders start and end. We know European boundaries change a lot. And what's interesting is, an Australian, when you come from a country with a geographical border, you think very differently about concepts of nativeness and what's introduced. So endemism, something is native, endemic, compared to something that's been introduced, and then something that can become invasive. So all these terms we have in Australia, things like, weed, invasive, endemism, they don't exist in the same way in Europe. It's very interesting. When I first came to Switzerland, I said, which are your native species and which ones is this an introduced species? I quickly realised that there's no word, and correct me if I'm wrong, in German for weed. I mean, it's Kraut, but that means herb. And I realised we have this whole vocabulary because we're very conscious of our topographical, geographical border. So it's made me think very differently around these concepts of what does it mean for something to be introduced? And at what point does something naturalise? So interesting concepts anyway. So Australia, of course, we've got lots of charismatic megafauna. It's what we're known for, but also lots of charismatic plants. And we know, of course, being a low nutrient soil country, we have a vast suite of different orchids, but every single one of them relies on a mycorrhizal fungal partner. So orchid seeds being so tiny, they don't actually have a food supply like most seeds. They actually require that fungal partner even to germinate. And most orchids keep that fungal partner throughout their life, even when they're photosynthesizing. We still don't understand the nature of that relationship. Is it truly mutually beneficial, or is there a bit of master-slave thing going on there? But certainly we know that in nature, every single orchid requires that fungal partner to germinate. But of course, there's also a mega diversity of fungi. Unfortunately, most of our authorities and park managers and governments haven't actually realised that yet. And we've been very focused on the first two Fs, the flora and the fauna, and the third F, the fungi, we often refer to as the forgotten F, the forgotten kingdom. And if you look at most of our protective legislation there, it defines biodiversity as flora and fauna. And it's only in recent years that we've managed to squeeze fungi into the equation. Australia is one of the world's 17 countries that are considered mega diverse, meaning that those 17 countries constitute 80% of the world's biodiversity. So we've got a mega diversity of fungi. I think we've named something like about 17,000, but they think that will increase by an order of magnitude. So we could have several hundred thousand species of fungi. I mean, now with all of these amazing sequencing techniques, the numbers of fungi are just going up through the roof. Of course, it's eucalypt dominated. We've got about 800 species of eucalyptus. All of them are mycorrhizal. I've seen different numbers for how many mycorrhizal fungi. Some say there's over 100 different species of mycorrhizal fungi and associated ECM fungi with eucalyptus. Others say there could be even 1,000 different species of fungi that form relationships. We think eucalypts are interesting. They're a bit like your willows over here in that they start off forming an arbuscular mycorrhizal relationship that then in a later stage, they then team up with ectomycorrhizal fungi. So very interesting genus. So just showing some of the eucalypts, but also most of the country is desert. And you think, wow, are there really fungi out there? I've had a hard time convincing the French of this, but they say now that Australia is the evolutionary centre of the world for hypergeous fungi, for truffle and truffle-like fungi. And I'm not sure whether you talk a lot about truffles or you have a lot of truffle or truffle-like fungi here, but one of the current theories is that for every hypergeous fungus, they actually started out as a cap and stalk style mushroom that's come up and gone, oh no, I'm in Australia. It's 44 degrees. It's not a great place to be a mushroom. And over time, they've actually got rid of the pileus, the cap and the stipe, and have remained within that consistent temperature and moisture and conditions of the subterrane. But the problem then is that you don't have wind to help disperse your spores. There's no wind underground, of course. So they've evolved alongside our great suite of digging mammals that actually bounce or hop along, smell the mushrooms, these amazing pheromonal-like smells they emit, dig them up, bounce off and distribute the spores. I think we've named something like about 1,200 truffle species in Australia, and many of them are actually in desert regions. In fact, we know of about a dozen species of desert truffles that were eaten by various Aboriginal groups. The women were the collectors of the truffle fungi, and they found them apparently by walking along, poking a stick into the sand and smelling the end of the stick, and that's how they found the truffles. Although I suspect they also probably stalked a wallaby or a bettong or a bilby or a bandicoot or a phascogale or some other mammal and followed them to find them. And certainly that's how I find truffles, is to look for those scratchings where there's been a wallaby or a potteroo. For example, a rabbit will make a very sort of vague scratch on the surface, but a potteroo will make a very, very small, distinct, discrete hole. And if you run your finger around the inside of that hole, you might be very unlucky and get a scorpion on the end when you pull it out. But if you're lucky, you'll find the truffles that the potteroo didn't smell because they weren't ripe and they weren't emitting an odour. So a truffle only emits the odour once the spores are ripe and viable and it wants to be eaten and distributed. And I used to think, gee, those potteroos are clever. They've taken their dinner, but they're leaving a few for tomorrow. And I thought, no, Al. They just couldn't smell them. They're relying on smell, not sight. So often you'll find them lyrebirds. Now, they're good. They don't eat truffles, but they walk along looking for invertebrates and they kick up the truffles when they're scratching around. They're like a great big, you've seen lyrebirds, like a great big chook with a big fancy tail. And they scratch the leaf litter and they kick up the truffles. So if you walk behind them, you can almost sort of catch them as you're walking behind them. So if you can stalk a lyrebird or a potteroo, it's a good start for finding truffles. So, but of course, 65% of Australia is under agriculture, lots of monocropping. Also, we use a lot of fire. And we have a lot of wildfire that are now burning a lot hotter. So, of course, we've got a lot of areas now that are pretty depauperate in terms of the fungi that are there. In Australia, I think this title, we can't actually see, it's below the menu there. It says serial killers stalk, I think it says fields. These are some of the headlines that appear in our newspapers. Killer mushrooms invade picnic spots. Can you believe that? Can you imagine you've just thrown down the picnic rub, got out your sandwich, poured the wine, in walk the killer mushrooms? I mean, these are the sorts of headlines that we get. It's taken a long time for us to get to relax around mushrooms. We're the classic mycophobic nation. Wild fungi death trap. I mean, we're getting a little silly. Other than the typo, it should be wild fungus death trap, but never mind. Poisonous mushrooms claim victims by the hundreds. It's a little misleading. This was actually a botulism case in tin mushrooms in China, but still it was a good headline for Australia. So these are the sorts of things we've had to, this was beware the killer mushrooms. Sorry, it's not quite fitting on the screen. Fortunately, there's also some very positive ones. Underground lovelies, don't overlook the beauty of the mushroom. Autumn glory, the fantastic fungus. So we're changing from quite a, I know these terms mycophobic and mycophilic are very simplistic. There's always a much bigger spectrum, but certainly, as I mentioned earlier, a much wider spectrum of people are coming to fungi in a more positive way. Our very first fungus to ever be described in 1790 was Aceroa rubra. And it was Jacques Labillardière, the French explorer, who was part of the D'Entrecasteaux expedition in southern Tasmania. And I always thought it was never going to be an LBM, a little brown mushroom. That was the first mushroom to be described. It was always going to be an outrageously flamboyant, very conspicuous one that stinks like hell. That was going to be the first one that caught the eye of the first botanist who was there. He took it back to France. It took 30 years for it to be described, but this was the very first species that was described in Australia. Then we've got other fungi, some of our more charismatic ones. This is Omphalodus nidiformis that contains a compound called illudin that causes it to bioluminesce. And it used to be called Pleurotus nidiformis. And people confuse it with Pleurotus ostreatus, the oyster mushroom. And sometimes online I see these posts where people say, I've been out all day foraging for oysters, Pleurotus ostreatus, just cooking them up. I'm thinking, oh dear, Pleurotus ostreatus doesn't grow in Australia. It's commercially produced, but it doesn't actually grow wild. So what they've picked are ghost mushrooms, which look very similar when they're not. This is exaggerated, the colour, because of the long exposure. They're not usually this bright. This one contains a very, very powerful emetic elutin. So if you eat it, it comes back up very quickly. And then you start to glow green. No, you don't. Just kidding. So this one causes considerable amount of poisonings, but it is one of our more charismatic fungi. In fact, the first example of what I call mycotourism in Australia is in a radiata pine plantation near Adelaide, or not near Adelaide, in South Australia, in the state of South Australia, where they've actually got this, the South Australian Forestry Commission has now called it Ghost Mushroom Lane. And they have these guided walks at night to see these fungi. They've had 20,000 people come through to see them, lots of school kids. And I think the kids are more interested in the ghost bit than the mushroom part, but still it gets them out there looking at fungi at night. I did a little survey a few years ago to find what we call flagship species. Do you use this term flagship species in conservation, where you use something that's very often charismatic, it's beautiful, or it's appealing for some reason? Often things like charismatic mammals, like on a global scale, we all know the polar bear, and we all know the black rhino, and we all know some beautiful orchids. But I was thinking, if we had a flagship fungus species, what would it be? In New Zealand, you might have heard of now I've just forgotten what it's called. It's Entoloma hochsteteri, the hidden pinkle. I've forgotten the common name. And they're the only country that has, or the first country to have that can't be right, a mushroom. Yes, it's the blue one, exactly. A beautiful blue. Maybe it's called the blue pink gill. I think that's the common name. Yeah, hochsteteri. And so I did a little survey with the public with about 10 or 15 very beautiful mushrooms. So there was the fly agaric, Amanita muscaria. There's a beautiful orange coral fungus, various other beautiful looking fungi, but this one got 50% of the votes. And I thought, wow, this one's called Mycena interrupta, or the Pixie's parasol. And I think there's something about being blue. There's not many blue fungi, and just being incredibly delicate and intensely blue. So I've been very interested. Most of the work I do is actually in the conservation of fungi, the ecology and conservation. And we've got these wonderful tools like red lists. Do you know this concept of red list? When something could be at risk of extinction, we do an assessment to see what is the extinction risk. And if it is at risk, we pop it on this list that supposedly it's then prioritised for conservation. The first one was the International Union of Conservation of Nature red list for plants. We've now got the global the global fungal red list that was set up by your colleague Greg Mueller at the Chicago Botanical Gardens and the Swedish mycologist Anders Dahlberg in Uppsala and Mick Krikorev. They set up this wonderful list to try and get species nominated for red listing. But red list is a concept. The first one was in 1964. At the International Union for the Conservation of Nature in Switzerland. That's almost a 60-year-old concept. And if you think about ecology, in the last 60 years, we've learned a lot. A lot of concepts have changed. Things like carrying capacity of an environment. This sort of concept's a bit out of date. The idea of equilibrium in environment's a bit out of date. We now talk about dynamic flux. Even the ideas, like when I studied zoology at university, we talked about symbiosis. Some organisms have this relationship called a symbiosis as an alternative strategy. We now know that everything's symbiotic. I mean, what organisms aren't symbiotic? So all I'm saying is ideas in ecology have grown and developed radically, and red lists are a useful tool, but it's quite an old concept. Of the between 2.5 and 4 million species of fungi in the world, we've named 151,000, which is roughly 4%. Are we ever going to name them all? Are we ever going to get those endangered ones on red lists? And so I kind of think red lists are one important tool in conservation, and we have other frameworks too to help us with conservation. But the area that interests me, that we often overlook, is this relationship between mycology, conservation, and aesthetics. And I think there's a lot we can learn from. When I watch people come in to look at this display I mentioned earlier in the workshops, I used to set it up very scientifically, have very strong taxonomic basis. They're all in their right groups. And then I realised that people were actually responding less to the science and more to the aesthetics. And now I still have a scientific basis, but I tried to make that display very visually and sensorially aesthetic. And I think initially people come to fungi oftentimes from aesthetics or from edible fungi, and then they go further. They get interested in the conservation or the ecology or the taxonomy or some other area. So this relationship between, I'm not saying they all have to be beautiful, and what is aesthetics, what is beauty? You know, it can be bizarreness, not just the classic beauty, but I think this is something we can use a little bit more. And this is another one in Australia called the ruby bonnet. It's got a really horrible scientific name. It's Cruenta mycena viscidocruenta. So it's a bit of a mouthful, but again, it's one of those fungi. Only stands maybe 1 centimetre high. The cap's about 0.5 centimetre across. People always spot it. It's such a tiny fungus, but they're literally like little rubies on the forest floor. Another group that is getting a lot of focus in recent years are the cordyceps fungi. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with cordyceps. It's a parasitic fungus that parasitizes different vertebrates. And the one on the left was known as cordyceps gunnii until quite recently. It's now changed to, Drechmeria gunnii. And the one on the right is called cordyceps robertsii. We've got quite a few different cordyceps. I think the one on the left is one of the largest cordyceps fungi in the world. And they've got, did you have this series over here called The Last of Us? Did you? Okay. So cordyceps inspired this series, of course, and there's been a lot of press in recent years, particularly around Ophiocordyceps sinensis, which occupies the Himalayan regions and has been used for several thousand years in traditional Tibetan and Chinese medicine. However, if any of you have seen some of the work that Paul Cannon has done from the fungarium, not the herbarium, the fungarium, where you go to have fun with fungi at Kew Gardens in England. He's done a lot of work with the people in Bhutan. And he's worked both with the mycologists, but also with the foragers who are collecting Cordyceps sinensis, Ophiocordyceps sinensis, but also the middle people. And we know there could be quite a lot of issues over there as the price has gone up something like 700% in the last decade. So it's causing all kinds of issues, not just environmentally, but also on a cultural, sociological level. Why did I mention that? There was some point to the story. That's right. But what I was going to say, there was this great bit of footage from David Attenborough. Do you remember this from, I can't remember which of his series it was. It might have been Life of Plants. And there's this great bit of footage where he goes down this tree in the Amazonian jungle. The camera's going down around the tree. It's got that fabulous music. Who was the composer from? I think it was George Fenton who wrote that music. Had this wonderful kind of carousel, 6/8 music is going down. And then they get to the forest floor. And there's all these different creatures because each cordyceps species parasitizes a different genus of arthropod or invertebrate. So there'd be a moth like this with these sort of trumpet-shaped sporing bodies coming out. And then there'd be a phasmid or a grasshopper like this with sort of orange ones coming out, and all these different invertebrates that have been infected by cordyceps. It's only like a 3-minute segment. And of course, they've probably taken months to film them all in different parts of the forest, but he's compiled this wonderful collection of the diversity of these different cordyceps. But beyond the sort of zombie thing, he says something really important at the end of that segment. And that is the purpose, if you can call it that, of these parasitic fungi. I mean, most of us don't like parasites. You mention the word parasite to people and they start scratching uncontrollably. We think leeches and ticks and we don't like the idea of things on us. But what he says is that what they do is that they regulate invertebrate populations in the tropical Amazonian forests or in any forest. Because if one insect, say a particular ant or a particular wasp, if the conditions change, maybe because of climate change, maybe because of something else, and that invertebrate starts to dominate, the cordyceps fungi wipe them out. They keep them in check. So he sees these parasitic fungi as the regulators of invertebrate populations in forests. So I think from an ecological perspective, beyond the inspiration for movies, they're a very, very important group of organisms. Now, I meant to look this up before I came. Do you have Iliodictyon here in Canada? You haven't seen this one? This fungus is a really interesting one. We call them cage fungi or basket fungi. They're in the phalloids, so they're in there with the more phallic-shaped stinkhorns and others. You have some stinkhorns here as well? Yeah, okay. So they're There's two we have in Australia, Iliodictin gracile and Sebarum. They're very, very, very similar. Actually, I think there's a third one as well. It's a mycorrhizal fungus in association with eucalyptus. Often you'll find them, though, in what we call ruderal environments. So environments that have been disturbed. So places like track edges and picnic grounds and campgrounds and places where there's been some level of disturbance. Obviously, they're quite good pioneer species. But this particular one was actually in a bit of wood chip in a garden outside a toilet block in a picnic ground. And I watched these people come past and they thought it was a child's toy. And I was lying on the ground photographing it. And they thought it was a rubber, because it doesn't look like a fungus. I mean, and then I picked it up and I put it in someone's hand and it was quite a large one. And I said, this is a fungus. Well, what did they do? Of course they drop it. But it has to be one of the most curious fungi I've come across. And I mean, what kind of evolutionary pressures acts on you to end up looking like that? I mean, it's the strangest thing. And of course, being in the stinkhorn family, they produce this slurry of spores, black spores. These ones have disappeared, that reek like carrion. So the idea is that you fool some unsuspecting fly to zoom on in, dance around with their hairy legs in the spore mass, and then they zoom off and distribute the spores. Very sneaky things, fungi, aren't they? They fool those poor flies. This is another interesting one called Cyteria gunnii, or the beach orange. We refer to the distribution as austral, which doesn't mean Australian, it just means southern. So it also occurs in Patagonia and South America. And this is an interesting one because Charles Darwin wrote about it when he was voyaging on the Beagle, and he noted that the First Nations people, or the Indigenous people of South America, were eating this as food. And we also know that the Tasmanian Aboriginal people use this as food as well. It only grows in association with Nothofagus, which is the southern beach. So you've got fagus. You got fagus here? Yeah, you'd have various fagus here. Ours is called Nothofagus. So this one's a very, very specific fungus that only grows in association with the Nothofagus. So coming back to that idea of aesthetics and conservation and people noticing beautiful fungi, I don't think this one's got to the Canadian shores yet, has it? It has. You've got that here. Favelaceae, it was originally Calicera. I think it's now Claudopus, or the orange ping pong bat. We think it originally came from Madagascar. Okay. I mean, it's a stunningly beautiful fungus. But what happens when a charismatic, stunningly beautiful fungus becomes a problematic invader? Then we've got a problem. This one is a saprotrophic fungus, a recycling fungus, one that grows on wood. It's not mycorrhizal, forming those connections. And we're not sure how it got to Australia, but we think possibly one of the theories is it came from Madagascar via New Zealand, perhaps in some of those wooden pallets, those packaging pallets, and then somehow got to Australia. I first noticed this in southern Victoria in about 2010. It was first recorded in 2004 in Melbourne. I had a look on iNaturalist the other day, and it's been recorded in 5,000 locations. Within 2 decades, it's been recorded in all these locations, and always again in ruderal environments, so often on track edges and parks and gardens, picnic grounds, which suggests that perhaps the vector, the thing that carries it, is Homo sapiens, is us. So what do? We've got this fungus everywhere now. Why is it a problem? Well, it secretes an antifungal into the wood it's inhabiting. So if you think about when a tree falls to the ground, over the succession of the life of that log, the succession of different fungal species will come in. When it hits the ground, there'll be some latent propagules already in the wood, usually things like what we call corticoid fungi or crust fungi that start to break down the outer bark. Over time, as that wood starts to decompose, there could be hundreds, if not thousands, of different species that come through. Some break down the lignum, some the cellulose, some the hemicellulose. There's some fungi we know in Tasmania that will only colonise a fallen tree that's been on the ground for 200 years. So some are very specialist in terms of the parts of the wood they break down. Some are generalists. They're there the whole way through that successional process. But what if one fungus secretes an antifungal and says, get out my log? I don't want you other fungi in there. What happens to the breakdown of that log if it actually can exclude other fungi? We think the antifungals it secretes are probably weakly antifungals. So maybe it's not excluding, maybe it's not. Maybe it excludes some but not others. No one's researching it. So, and this is the thing, mycology in Australia is just starting to find its feet. We don't have very many researchers, although we're now getting more and more young PhD students who are getting really excited and interested to research particular issues. But this is a really interesting one. And for me, we've got lots of, in Australia, we've imported lots of species over the years that have then become problematic. You've probably heard of the cane toad, what happened with the cane toad in Australia. Of course, rabbits, blackberries, gorse, foxes, all these things. But we haven't really ever talked about fungal weeds, but perhaps this one could be one of our first problematic ones. You all know the fly agaric, Amanita muscaria. We think this was introduced to Australia, possibly by the Canadians, actually. Good on you. There's different thinking about it. We had some Canadian gold miners, and there's some thinking it could have come in with gold miners, but others say no, it would have certainly been with early forestry. So when foresters were testing out Northern Hemisphere species to see which would be good species for wood production in Australia, we looked at things like what was then called Pinus insignis, now called Pinus radiata. We also looked at Pinus ponderosa, all these different conifers. And this fungus was brought in with the Pinus radiata plantations. Whether it was accidental initially or whether they deliberately brought it in, because we didn't understand a lot about mycorrhizal relationships back then. But over the last 100 years, it stayed pretty contained within its pine forests. And everyone loves seeing it. Such a charismatic fungus, probably the most revered fungus in the world. You give someone some pencils, what do they draw? You give them coloured pencils, colour it red, make sure you leave the white spots. It's probably the most well-known fungus, the most mythologized fungus worldwide. There's a historian in Sweden called Anders Hirel, and he's written a book, unfortunately it's in Swedish, only about this fungus. The whole book is about the mythology and the science of this fungus. So we know a lot about it. A few years ago, in Australia and in New Zealand, the fly agaric must have got bored with its Pinus radiata partner, and it looked over to the native beech forests, the Nothofagus forests, and said, they look pretty attractive. It's latched onto the root system of the Nothofagus. It's knocked off the native fungal partners on the Nothofagus, moved into the native forest, and it's pulling the pine forest with it. In New Zealand, there's some researchers who are actually looking at the roots of the Nothofagus to see, have those other native fungi managed to hang on, or have they been excluded by what they're calling the aggressive invader of the fly agaric? So if you think about it, when a tree has multiple mycorrhizal partners, they do different things. Some are good at bringing back water, some play a defence role, some are drought-proofing, some are perhaps knocking out the nematodes or other invertebrates that could damage the roots, some are very good at getting phosphorus, some are good at getting other things. When you've got multiple fungal partners, you shore up your chances of survival because they're doing different things. But if you lose that suite of different partners and you've got one, that could weaken your resilience and actually weaken the resilience of the forest. So there's a really interesting questions and not enough researchers looking at them. This is another one that came in accidentally. We think, it's always hard to know when something arrives and when something's first seen, because something could be there for a long time. If someone goes, what are you doing here? So first recorded in Canberra in 1960. Wasn't mentioned again until 1985 when someone harvested it and it cost them their life. So the death cap we know, deadly fungus, and why it's problematic to help people is it's characterised by delayed onset of symptoms. So you eat it and you could feel fine for 12 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours, even up to 72 hours in some cases until people actually show symptoms, by which time the toxins move through your cells. It's both cytotoxic, so it destroys cells, and destroys organs. That's why they say unless you get a really quick response time, it's very little they can do to help you beyond that. This one came in association with quercus or oak, particularly Quercus robur, but it's been found with about 15 species of European, North American and Asian oak species. And they've now found evidence of it perhaps switching to another mycorrhizal European broadleaf tree. So it's fairly concentrated around cities and towns in Australia because we don't have native oak and it's mostly native bush. But this is another one that's an interesting one particularly because some of you may have heard a couple of months ago, there was a very tragic case of 3 people dying having eaten this fungus. And of course, the media's made a whole circus about it. We still don't know the circumstances surrounding that, but it's a terrible thing to think that 3 people lost their lives having eaten. It could have been. I must get, yeah, indeed. It's what? It's gone on to our really? Okay, yeah. I think. Okay. Right. So did it also come in with another quercus or okay? Not quercus. Interesting. That's right. Okay, yes, we had this. That's right. Interesting. Do you know this fella? I was saying this. Yeah, this is the poison fire coral fungus, Trichoderma. Is it Trichoderma? Yeah, it was Podostroma. I think it's now Trichoderma cornudamae. Yeah, and this is the one it's throughout Asia, parts of Asia, Japan, Korea, the peninsula. Yeah, and this is the one that's sometimes been mistaken for some of the medicinal fungi that they use in various teas. So this one's now found in Australia as well. So just to very, very quick whiz through some of the places that I went through in the writing of the most recent book, often working up in these glacial environments where as these glaciers recede, of course, the first organisms you see colonising the bare rock are fungi, the lichens. And so lichens, of course, being a partnership of fungi and algal, and we often call them extremophiles because they're there growing in the middle of waterfalls. They can withstand such extreme conditions. And there's a few others too that are pretty good at withstanding extreme conditions. The book then took me across to Iceland, where I had the great pleasure of working with a ranger there who was extremely concerned about after the financial collapse over there, the rapid increase in tourism. And he's saying basically we can't build infrastructure fast enough for the number of tourists, and we're losing our lichen. So again, really interesting working with different people. This was in the Laura Silva forests of the Portuguese Madeira, where this island comes out up to 2,500 metres. So you've always got clouds buffeting around. You've got the oldest tracks of Laura Silva forests that once clothed much of Europe, and a very particular mycota or fungi growing there. Very few people researching them. Across to the lichenscapes of Sweden and elsewhere in Fennoscandia, working with all sorts of people. This is the Stockholm Mycological Society. I went out on a week with them where they survey all these different environments, and there's 70 odd people there. They come back, work on the microscopes all afternoon. They've got a very comprehensive data bank of their fungi, very, very well mapped. Across to the turning beech forests of the French-Swiss border, where I was working with the International Union for the Conservation of Nature scientists there, trying to get fungi onto the agenda. Oh, sorry about that. This is Teresio Valsesia in northern Italy, who's a chanterelle forager. So again, going from scientists to students to foragers. There's some of his mushrooms he was foraging. Across to Finland, where recently I was working with some PhD students, again, putting fungi into the equation of how we manage forests and how we restore environments. I mean, often when we're restoring a damaged, this seems to be on a route of its own now. When we're restoring environments, often we're putting in the trees, but we're not thinking about, it's going again, the importance of getting that infrastructure. And then across to the Pacific Northwest. How do I pause that there for a second? Could you pause that for me just on the last slide? Can I take 5 minutes more just to read you a very, very short excerpt from the book? And then I'll show you the very final slide. Thank you. I've got no idea what time I started or how long. You're going to say to me you're supposed to talk for 20 minutes. Was that right? Okay. I'll just read you one very brief excerpt, which is the very beginning of the book. If I can find it, which starts in the United Kingdom. It was raining in Whitby. That was hardly unusual, and I should have been pleased. Everybody knows that rain brings mushrooms. Westerly winds swept over the North York moors, delivering showers in squalls and spurts along England's Yorkshire coast. I was there for an international congress on fungal conservation, and the dampness boded well for fruitful field trips. But right then I was trying to hitch a ride to the congress dinner and was already late, and the rain ran cold down the back of my neck. A vehicle appeared, slowed almost to a standstill, then sped off, spraying me with water. The road returned to darkness. Gulls mewed in the distance as another vehicle appeared, blinding me with its headlights, but it slowed and stopped. I ran toward it. It was only when the tailgate flipped down and the back window flipped up that I saw it was a hearse. "Well, get in then," barked a voice in a North Yorkshire accent. I probably should have hesitated, but I didn't. I leapt in and cracked my knee on something hard. It was a coffin. A coffin in a hearse shouldn't seem odd, but the three Goths sitting bolt upright inside it drinking champagne did. They eyed me suspiciously as one passed me a glass. He filled it to the brim as champagne overflowed down my sleeve. "So where'd you be going then this fine evening?" he asked. My knee throbbed, and I could feel the hair stuck to the sides of my face as I shook out my sleeve. "To a congress on the quay," I replied, then added, "A congress on fungi." He squinted and pursed his blackened lips. No one spoke. The windscreen wipers flapped louder. You'd have thought that with our common interest in the subterrane that I'd landed with kin, but the other two Goths glanced sideways and one raised an eyebrow. It seemed the Fungus Congress and the Whitby Goth Weekend had been programmed simultaneously, and we each thought the other the more strange. But after a prolonged silence, the questions about fungi came thick and fast until the driver cranked up the stereo and the Sisters of Mercy saved me from further interrogation. As we turned onto the quay, I caught sight of the ruined Whitby Abbey perched high on the headland overlooking the North Sea. Pedestrians dashed across the wet road. "Here, stop here, please," I yelled to the driver, and he pulled into the curb. I handed back my glass and wished the Goths well. They nodded in unison as I climbed out of the hearse. Back in the rain, I paused a moment to gather myself, then headed toward the lights of the restaurant, certain that my foray into fungal realms would be every bit as thrilling as the ride. So that's how the book starts. I just wanted to show you my last couple of slides. We're talking about charismatic megafauna, things like this. We all know these images, but have you thought of this? Don't you think that's even cuter? And then I thought, our Australian, whatever you call this, national emblem, we've still got the kangaroo and the emu. I mean, this has been there since Federation. It's time. What do you think? Actually, he's doing this some kind of crime. This is like sort of scribbling in your passport or something, isn't it? I'll probably go directly to jail for doing that. Thank you for tolerating me and bearing that. If you've got any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them. Thank you so much.
Well, in my mind, I think fungi. And I saw that map of Australia that you put out. And I initially didn't say it was Australia. And I said, oh, nice, some different species. You know?
There you go. Except I think it was a tubifera. I'm not sure, but making the map, the leaf, yes. Yeah, we could do it with that. Yeah. There you go. Fantastic. Favourite edible? The one that Kurt cooks me. Look, chanterelles are pretty hard to beat, aren't they? I mean, they really are. Although, you know, funnily enough, one of the species that I think is really overlooked and underrated are the shaggy manes, the ink caps. Aren't they great? I mean, people sort of overlook them, but I think they often grow on roadsides. I think of them as being a bit like we call it the SES, the State Emergency Service. When everything goes haywire, when there's a flood or a fire, we call them the State Emergency Service. And those fungi are like that. As soon as there's a disturbance and, those fungi pop up, they're early colonizers and pioneers. I think of them putting that structure back into the soil and putting that organic matter back. But if you get them just right and cook them in a flash. What about you? What's your favourite? They're so good, aren't they? Which one is? Ah, okay. Yeah. That's sporassus, cauliflower? Yeah. I don't think we've got sporassus. We do have, did you say hedgehogs? Yeah. Yeah, so we thought ours was Hydnum repandum, and then recently I think we realised it's called Hydnum. Oh, I just lost the species epithet. It'll come to me. It's not repandum. It'll come to me. We do, but
umbilicatum.
Excuse me.
Umbilicatum.
No, it's not. No, that's North American, I think. Hydnum. Really? Okay.
That's a European species.
Yeah. Okay. And it's not umbilicatum either. It's Oh, it'll come to me as soon as. Do you know that? I think actually, yeah, I think I agree with you totally. When they're small, I find they get bitter as they get too large. So it's a matter of finding them small enough, but they're nowhere near as common as here. I don't see them every season, and you don't tend to find them in those vast quantities. Yeah. Right. Okay. Wow. And wonderful texture. They are superb, aren't they? Yeah. Wow. Fantastic. Goodness. And as sweet as the Hydnum? Okay. Oh, wow. Okay. Thanks for all these tips. That's great. Got that, Kurt? Yeah.
Clavaria delphus truncatum.
What about it?
It's a delicious mushroom, and it's very good in desserts.
Oh, okay. I've photographed this a few times. I didn't even realize it was edible. That's good to know.
Oh, it's a good edible and nice texture too.
Fantastic. Great hints. That's it. Fantastic. Thanks, Sinclair. Sorry, someone was asking.
This was the response to the foraging and whatnot in Norway and Finland when you were there. You were there for the fall?
Yes, yeah. So the response in terms of, is it popular or yeah. I tell you what, you never get between a Swede and a chanterelles. I mean, again, people predominantly forage. I mean, they call it Sebarus. I don't know whether it is Sebarus, and also tubiformis and also Cornucopioides. That's Craterellus, isn't it, I think? So those three are all really popular, but predominantly chanterelles. I think they call the Biodiversity Jacobs pils or something. It's got another name for it. They do, but again, I mean, I find the further east I notice you go in Europe, the greater the range of fungi people forage for. Like in France, it's pretty much truffle, chanterelles, Bletis edulis. But I had if we get Poles or Slovenians or Romanians in the workshop, they tend to forage for a much broader range of fungi. And I guess it's, again, following economic lines. When you subsistence forage, you forage for a greater range. But certainly chanterelles are a favourite. But foraging, what's really different is this concept of allemansrätt, every man's right, every man and woman's right to forage on private and public land, so long as you're only taking for your use and you're not causing any damage to the. And is that the case? Is that what you call it here? Because you can forage on Crown land. See, in Australia, we can only forage on private land with permission of the landholder. So you can't forage on any public land, and most people don't know that. So that's also sort of, we don't have a big tradition of foraging, but also now people go to the pine plantations because they're privately owned by the Americans. But if you're on that land without permission, then it's trespass. So there's all these kind of irritating sort of things. So you typically have to be on your land or someone else's land to forage. And Australians don't forage for native species. They forage for the North American or European species because we know about the edibility. So it's very different situations. What I mean, it's very different in different countries. So they tend to be in the pine forests when it's predominantly Northern Hemisphere species that Australians will eat because the native species, the edibility just isn't known. And there's also a big difference between edibility and palatability. So, for example, we know Aboriginal people ate 12 different varieties of truffles, or 8, perhaps some still do. But when you've been foraging for something for tens of thousands of years, that's very different to today, where most of us have a sugar and salt addicted palate, that what was considered edible might not be considered palatable today. So all these really interesting ethnomycological sort of dimensions to foraging and edibility. So I've gone off on a weird tangent from your question. So
a quick note, although we are entitled to forage on Crown lands, it's becoming increasingly more difficult. The forest companies control these Crown lands. They're gated off more and more frequently, even with guards, and it's harder and harder to go on to any land in this region and forage for mushrooms. Also, I'm just guessing that there must be at least 25 species here that we commonly forage for food.
Wow. Right. Okay, so the private roads that, I see. Interesting. Yeah. I think it's a similar thing in Australia, like to what Sinclair was saying, in that same thing with a lot of them are owned by Hancock Holdings, which is an American company who have put the roads in, but also they see it as often they've blocked off those roads to public access to foragers because they want to bring their logs out. They don't want cars parked, when Australians like to park the car in the middle of the road. They just say they don't want any interference to their logging operations. So, which is a great shame, but. Oh, interesting. Gee, it shows that you really need to know what the laws are in your area, doesn't it? Like moving around the world, particularly, you need to know and often it is regional rather than a national set of protocols. Was there a question at the back? Yeah. Yeah, pottery. So there's all these weird. Have you heard of numbats? We've got all these crazy. There's also wallaroos, which is sort of a mix between a kangaroo and a wallaby, and then you've got potteroos, which is similar, a small bouncing thing with big back legs and a pouch. But yeah, there's all these kind of different size, different models of them. So you've sort of kangaroos, wallabies, potteroos, wallaroos. Yeah, and then you've got bilbies, bettongs, bandicoots, numbats, phascogales. So they're all mammalian. And we know of, I think I always say 35. I read a paper recently that said there's over 50 species of native mammals that we know of that in autumn, for some of them, it can be up to 100% of their diet, truffle flakes. So particularly potteroos and bandicoots, I think. And they've got these very long noses, digging claws. And the thing is, when we lose these digging mammals from particular areas because we've put in housing estates or development or whatever, and we've lost these mammals. You've got a picture. Fabulous. I know they're amazing, aren't they? We don't get this, the natural turning over of the soil. They're very important, I guess, ecosystem engineers, as we call them, in terms of, aerating soil and dispersing spores and letting water into our soils. Our soils are very hydrophobic, water repellent because of eucalyptus leaves, because they're so adapted to a desiccating climate. They've got this waxy cuticle, they secrete all these oils, and the leaflet, or do you call it duff, the organic matter on the ground becomes hydrophobic. So these mammals are very important in turning it over, allowing water to filtrate down into the soil. And there's an interesting study recently by a woman called Susan Nuske in Australia, and she looked at mammals that are generalists with truffles that only eat, or eat a variety of species. But then there's specialists who only eat species X and species Y. And what she found is if we lose those specialist mammals, the generalists don't replace them in what they eat. So what that means is those particular fungi, if they lose their vector, we lose those truffle fungi. And do we have invasives? We don't have squirrels. Probably the biggest invasive mammal that they're seeing as problematic are deer. And that's only in the last couple of decades. They've really recently sort of got out of control, and there's a lot of, and pigs, of course, are the other really big one. Yeah, to replace those. But yeah, well, that's what she was hoping, that other mammals would replace the specialists, but it doesn't seem to be the case. So, and I think, yeah, I mean, we've got wild camels when they're not going to be eating the herbivores rather than omnivores or omnivores, I should say, or what do you call funguses? Fungivores or mycovores? Yeah, fungivores. So that relationship between your mycophages, your fungus eaters, mammalian or invertebrate, is super interesting, particularly because the truffles have evolved alongside the mammals, but we're losing a lot of those mammals, particularly due to the fox and domestic dogs and domestic cats. And when recently I saw a study up along the Murray River, one of the major river systems in Australia, and they trapped some wild dogs, and the main component of their diet was echidnas, like porcupines. There's spiky things, but they'd worked out how to flip them over and go in through the soft part of the belly. So, yeah.
Coming back to bacterial contamination and poison, there was a paper about 18 years ago in Europe, I think in Germany, where they showed about 80% all that poison were contaminated fungi.
Really?
Yeah, bacteria. There's a comment here, if you can read it, for the previous comment.
Oh, could you read it out for me?
Appreciate the comment about eating rotten with bacteria and mushrooms. Have a paper coming in a future Fungi magazine of photographs taken in supermarkets of rotten wild mushrooms on shelves. Many misidentified or mislabeled as rotten. Who's that by? That was Dennis Benjamin. Yes, Dennis. All right, yes. Dennis has written the Bible on poison.
Wow. Oh, I must get that Bible. That's a...
Dennis is doing your edition, trying to... Is that Dennis in the meeting? All right. Because Dennis, I was just talking to him last week, and he decided to do a second edition. First one is about 23 years old, and it's superb. If I had known, I would have shown it to you. I've got a copy.
Wow, that's one. If Dennis is still there, please thank him for that comment. And yeah, was there any other questions there that
I'm afraid to touch a lot of buttons.
Oh, thank you, Mel, for passing that on. Sorry I've gone so long and kept you from dinner or wherever you're heading. Sorry, Dan.
I'll send you.
I'd be delighted. Maybe I can find a copy somewhere.
Very, very hard.
Yeah.
But he writes prolifically in fungi.
Okay, wonderful. I'll look that up for sure. There's a really good paper by Julian White and colleagues who developed a system. Julian White.
Excellent. December
Yes, and that was the paper. Yeah, fantastic. And they had various American, European colleagues who wrote that, and he developed this system with, I think it's 21 different categories. Yeah.
Very brief presentation.
Okay. Okay.
I just show that how even a layperson can identify which mushroom falls with poison.
Exactly. Brilliant. And we used the same framework from that in our wild mushrooming book. So that's correct. Yeah. And so we thought that was such a good network. So we've sort of based our toxicity section on that same, because it's a great framework, isn't it? Yeah, I agree. Yes. Thank you all so much, Mel. Thanks again for this opportunity. And thank you all so much for coming and being such a delightful and patient audience. I really appreciate your interest. And how do I get a Canadian passport? And thank you also for coming along as well. I really appreciate it. Yeah. Thanks, everybody. And Steve as well. Oops.